Hello everybody. I think we're just about set. I think we waited long enough, so let's get this workshop started. So welcome everyone to today's workshop, which will be all about building a full stack application from scratch, part 1. This includes doing all the wire-up necessary for getting Express to work, getting MongoDB to connect using the Mongoose NPM library, and authentication using Passport. Now, this will be quite content-packed. I'm actually quite surprised that this will even fit in 1 hour. So we're going to do our best. Maybe some of the code will be written quite fast. But if you ever find yourself getting lost or anything, the code is always hosted here, which I will share by the end of the session. You can find the entire code, and even it will even have additional comments to make understanding it easier, just so that we can actually cover it, because it's a huge amount of content for just 1 hour. Now, what we will be covering today in this session will be only the server-side code. That's what we have time for. Then part 2, which starts 2 hours from now, it's another workshop that will be covering unit testing and automation, or more specifically, the continuous integration pipeline with Travis, as well as deploying to Heroku. The front end is not covered yet. I am planning to maybe do a workshop on how to build the front-end integration. But if you're curious, and I don't blame you, if you're having trouble wiring up the front end to this server side, I also made a front end for the app here. You can actually find it all inside the public folder. And this is the front end for the app. It's actually live on Heroku already. So you can test the app right here to see what it looks like. It has functional login, functional sign up, functional note keeping. So for example, if I just log in super quickly, this is you'll be building today the backend that will be used to get something like this all set up. So once I log in, I already have a few test notes which I created, as you can see right here. I can open notes, I can edit notes, I can go back to the note keeping, and I can delete notes. So all these server endpoints, this is what we'll be focusing on today. Or more specifically, you could be and will be testing with this with something like Postman. So these are all the routes that we need to get to work by today. So that's the login, the authentication login, authentication refresh, the ability to retrieve users, to create users, and then also to retrieve actual posts. Now, as far as the theme for the application, it will be just Jotted, which is the app theme I made. So just Jotted is a minimalist notebook on the cloud, as you just saw. So we'll be building our own sort of Evernote, but medium hybrid. So it's just something where you can just write down notes on the cloud and just keep them for future reference. So yeah, I think that's about enough of the description. Let's get started. So as we're all great projects, we will start with a blank slate. There's absolutely nothing already set up. It's just a blank folder on my desktop, as you can see here. So there's absolutely nothing on the folder. So okay, let's get started with this. So our first step would be to initialize a new Git repository. So let's initialize that. There we go. So that's now being tracked by Git. Now our second thing to do would be to add a git ignore. Why do we need a git ignore file? Well, we do because otherwise when you push it to GitHub, it will push the node modules folder, which you don't want that to happen. Node modules is insanely big, and anybody who wants to run your project can just run npm install and automatically install them. So you don't want Git to push your node modules folder ever. To get it to not install them, you just have to add a .gitignore file, like so. So new file, .gitignore, and then this file we can just add what we want to ignore. So we can do something like node modules, and that ignores everything except node modules. But because it needs to be a bit more specific than that, I'm just going to use a lovely page called gitignore.io, which I love using. So here I can just add a configuration for node and just do the code, since he also adds some junk. And just in case macOS, because I do work, I have a Mac at work, so this is my personal computer. But yeah, so this code that you get, you just copy it and paste it, like so. So now that our project is all set up, let's initialize our project as an npm repository. So let's do npm init. I'm just going to say yes to all the default questions. All right, so that's our npm installation all set up correctly. Now we need to start installing the first dependencies which we will need for today. So to get started, we need to install Express, Joy. If you haven't heard about Joy, it's okay, don't worry. We will learn about it very soon enough. So Express, Mongoose, Morgan, and yeah, let's add Passport as well. And Joy. Okay, so while that's setting up, that's going to install the Node modules, then we should start by adding our server file. Now, let's before we start writing our Node code, let's create a folder for all the Node.js code. Let's just call it app, since that makes quite a bit of sense. And then inside app, we're going to start writing our server. So here's our server.js file.
Hi, one question. Is this recording available?
Oh, good question, Shravani. Yes, I'm actually recording right now. I will be pushing this to YouTube. And yeah, so you can watch over this. Great question. Yeah, totally. I bet it would be really handy, especially for something as large as this.
Yes. Okay, thank you. Okay.
Sure. So we go to our server.js file, and then let's start coding. So first we require Express. Give me 1 second. There we go. Express. Give me just 1 second. I'm having a problem with my recording software. Let me just hide the HUD. There we go. Sorry. I was just having some problems. There we go. Let's set up. Let's continue coding. So let's require Express. Let's also require Morgan. Now, Express you're all familiar with. Express is what makes sure you can code an actual server. Morgan is actually something we just use for logging. It makes it easier to just see what requests are being made. Then we require Mongoose, which is something we'll be using very soon, because we want to connect to our MongoDB database. And last but not least, Passport, because we will be using that for authentication. So the first thing is getting our server to start up, right? So before we do that, we need to initialize our Express app like so. So this starts our Express, but like basically just creates the app for Express. Once that's set up, we create a variable where we will save our server instance. Right now it's empty, but it won't be. It won't be forever. Now, after that's created, we also need to make sure we hook up any middleware. So middleware, for those unfamiliar, is literally just like an interceptor. So it's something that can intercept calls before they actually get to the server. So say I make a call as the front end, the client, to the server. If there's any middleware involved, that will intercept the call and do something with it. So in this case, our first middleware will be our logger. So we can be sure that every single request we make is logged. So we're going to use Morgan and going to use the combine setup. Somebody's muted. Facundo, let me mute you. No worries. There we go. No worries. Now let's continue where we left off. So that's our middleware. That's going to be logging our requests. Then we would need to set up. This is kind of interesting. This middleware we're writing right here is so we can actually just so we can actually access the body contents inside the request. I'll let you guys know soon enough when we're actually using this, but just know it's important that they do it at this level because that makes it easier to use. And also, I think I'm already making a typo. Oh, you guys also still hearing him? I thought I muted him. Facundo, can you please mute yourself? I thought I muted you, but that's kind of weird. Apologies. I'm sorry. I don't blame you. I had myself join non-muted too many sessions, and I I don't blame you. It's happened to me so many times, and in way more embarrassing situations. But whatever. Let's go back to it. So I'm actually making some mistakes here, and this is why I love VS Code. It intelligently scans your code and lets you know if what you're doing is right. So it detected that I forgot to do the app.use. That's the actual function that consumes the middleware. So let's keep going. Let's now finally do our app.use static middleware. So this middleware is actually super important because the static middleware is what allows you to actually have front-end the code served from the server side. So for example, if I have a public folder created like so, I can now create pages inside of here, like, I don't know, let's name this test.html. We'll be able to access this from the server. So let's create a test page. I don't know why that's not being, there we go. So let's just name this test page. Let's just add a hello world. That's a test page. We'll access it soon enough. Now that that's set up, let's continue writing our server side. Let's just add a simple route handling here to, in case we make a request that is not found by any of our endpoints, we're just going to answer it with a very generic, handling. So let's request.response, and let's do response.status of 404, and respond with a JSON of error not found. So when we get this message, it means you try to access a route which we didn't handle. You'll see it soon enough. And finally, let's start writing the functions that actually start and stop the server. Now, this will be a bit more complex because we're also going to be already doing the Mongo integration. I find it easier that you basically know that you need the MongoDB database to be working. So let's just handle all of it. It's going to be starting the Mongo database connection and only then connecting Express. So first step, let's create a function called start server. Then inside of here, we're going to return a new promise. Don't worry about this part. This is just something we will definitely use once we get to the unit testing part. So resolve, reject, and then let's go to mongoose.connect. Now, let's just leave this as a placeholder, but we need to enter a valid Mongo URL here. Let's not worry about that soon enough. So let's do that. Let's pass in and use new URL parser, just because that's the new way of doing things. And then lastly, the callback, which is error, and there we go. So this function will run once Mongoose connect attempt goes, and then we need to make sure we're checked for the error. So if we do get an error, we're going to first log it to the console. So we're going to do console.log error, and then, you know what, let's not log it. Let's just throw an error. So our entire application will just shut down because there was a problem starting the application. So throw an error, and that should be it. Let's see if that worked. Why are we getting Mongo is an error is not assignable of parameter of type string. Okay, I guess we could just maybe, you know what, let's just log it because I think it's not worth just figuring this out. Let's just log it super quickly, and let's return reject the response to say we couldn't start the server correctly. Now let's continue here. So this assumes it did start. Now we need to start Express. So MongoDB connected. Now let's start our Express file. So let's save inside, remember the global that I told you about a while ago, that server? That's where we're going to save the instance of Express. So we're going to do app.listen, and then inside listen, we're just going to pass it the port, which is going to be something like 8080. And then in the callback that gets executed when this runs, we're going to do something like console.log, and then something helpful like Express server listening on HTTPS. Wait, it's not HTTPS. Localhost 8080. All right. Now, let's write the function to stop the server. Now, this function will be run every time we need to shut down the server manually. So let's, same steps, return. This time, because Mongoose already returns a promise for this disconnection, we can just return it here. So do mongoose.disconnect, and then execute that, and then if it does disconnect, let's return a new promise. Return new promise, same as before, resolve reject. And inside of that, we're going to just call our server.close. Now, the reason why we can do this is only because when we started our Express server, we saved it into a global variable, as you can see right here. So that allows us to later use that same variable to shut it down. So we can do a server.close, and then if server.close, I don't know, if that returns an error. So if it returns an error, the usual console.log error, and return reject the error. Otherwise, we just do console.log express server shut down, and finally just resolve the promise. And that's about it. We're still having some typos here, which I'm guessing might be, yep, that was a typo. So far we are doing very good. Now, let's see if there's anything we could be missing. Oh yeah, configuration. So right now I'm hard coding all of these variables, like the numbers I'm using, the MongoDB database connection. But you know what? I'm not going to do that. I'm going to create a configuration file to just make it easier for me to manage all of these configuration variables. I'm just going to create a config file, JS. Then inside of this config file, I'm going to add my configuration. Now this one I already have made, so I'm just going to paste it in, because otherwise it will take me quite a bit long to go over that. So this is my configuration file. So basically what we're doing here is just setting all the variables we need for our app. So I already researched and found all the most common HTTP status codes, like HTTP status code OK, created, no content, bad request, unauthorized, not found, blah blah blah. So same thing goes. My Mongo URL, I already have a default connection. So this is just the default URL for MongoDB, and then I just add the name of the database. These are all just for what we'll be needing when we get to testing, and these two will be used for when we get to authentication. All right, good. Now now that is set up. Now, just before I move on, quickly to maybe clear up some questions you guys might already be having. This syntax, all it's doing, it's called the OR syntax, and it's something we use a lot to set default variables. So all this syntax means is, hey, please assign to this variable the environment variable of port, but if it doesn't exist, then default to this variable. So basically just saying, please try to see if this variable exists, and if it doesn't, default to this one. So it's a super handy syntax. We definitely want to get into the habit of using. Now, to be able to use that more plentifully, we need to actually import that into our server.js. So let's do that right now, like so. So let's import it here. Here would be a good place. There we go. So here we're going to import our port. We're going to import our status codes. We're going to import our Mongo URL, and this one I don't think we need yet. So let's just do like that. So we just imported all of this, and now let's start filling in the blanks. So here we're going to do HTTP status codes not found, and then instead of my Mongo's database URL, I'm just going to do Mongo URL. I have that variable imported, and then instead here I will just use the port variable, and I'm just going to make this a smart string to make it easier for me to just reflect live. So that way, if you change the port, then the message changes. And I think we're good. We pretty much have everything necessary. Now we just need to write a file that will run our server. So let's call it start.js. And all this file will do basically is literally just call the function to start our server. So something like this. So it will import a variable called start server. Then it imports it from the app folder server file, and then it runs it. Notice how we're having a problem saying this property is not found. So it's probably because we forgot to export it. So if you notice, we forgot to create an export. So let's do that right now. Let's export our entire project. So let's do the export at the bottom. module.exports, and let's export everything from the app to start server to stop server. Save that, check the start, that looks like that works. And then as the cherry on top, so we can actually run this, we need to set our scripts. We want to add a new script called start. And here we're just going to type the name of the script we want to run. So it's going to be node and then start.js. Now that that's set up, I think we should be able to just run npm start. And fingers crossed. There we go. Express server listening on localhost. Let's try that out. So let's just go to localhost. There we go. That's working. You see that error not found? Well, we actually wired that up. If you remember, we wrote a route that, because we have no route handling right now, it just uses the default that returns are not found. But because we did set our public folder as a static route, it basically, if you write any URLs that match any files instead of public, it reroutes it. So to show you, I'm just going to type the name of a file that we do have, like test.html, and see how that works. So basically that static is what allows you to serve static assets from the front end. But yeah, enough of that. How about we start adding some routes? So to do that, we're going to first start with our user model. So we're going to add inside of app, we're going to add a new folder called user. So in user, we're going to start defining our user model. Now to do that, we're going to create a new file called user.model. And then inside of here, I'm going to require everything I need, like to create a model, I'm going to use Mongoose. Then I'm just going to clone this multiple times and import Joy, which is also something we need. And you know what, I might as well add bcrypt because we are going to be using that very soon. Okay, now that that's set up, I might as well make sure I install bcrypt. I don't want to forget. So npm install bcrypt. And while that's going on, let's start defining our schemas. Now, for those unfamiliar, the schemas are the blueprints that serve to basically define what any document should look like inside of your database. I seem to be having some problems. What could be it? Let's check. I think it didn't install it, but we're just getting some weird errors. Well, we'll find them soon enough. No worries. Basically, you need to define a schema to say how you want the documents in this collection to look like. Right now, our database is completely blank. As you can see, I have my robot3t. There's no databases. So I'm going to create my new user schema. So the way I made mine, it's going to have a name of type string, an email, username, and password. All will be strings, and all will be required. Okay. So far good. This is what every single new user has to look like. Then we want to also add a serialized method. This is super important because MongoDB, the MongoDB objects have a lot of private information you don't want to send to the user. So that's why you use serialized to only return what you need. In this case, you only want to be returning the name, email, and username. You do not want to be returning the password ever. So notice how I don't include it in my serialization field. And also notice how I do include the ID, but because MongoDB, this is super important. This is one of the most common beginner mistakes I've seen all my students make. When you see something with an underscore, that means that's a MongoDB thing. So you will only be using underscore ID on the server side. On the front end, basically you will be returning the ID. Question from Evgeny Kashian. We use serialize to basically sanitize the information before sending it to the front end. Basically, MongoDB has a lot of, you could call it junk, but at the same time sensitive information you do not want to send to the user. So we're going to be calling serialize on user objects before we return them to the front end. You'll see soon enough. Once serialization is done, we also want to add more methods like the ability to hash a password, as well as the ability to validate passwords. Now, for those unfamiliar, hashing is the process of converting a password into basically a hash. So that way, even if somebody hacks your database, they won't ever get the real passwords. They just get the hash. And a hash is nearly unbreakable. So it's actually a security feature that you should never store passwords. So that's why before we store the user's password in the database, we actually hash it and only store the hash, okay? Now that that's set up, let's also set up a way to see, because we don't store the real user's password, then the only way to compare and see if their password is correct is by validating it, by using a validation method, which just compares the hash that you stored versus the password that was provided by the user. If this doesn't make too much sense, not to worry. It's something that you don't really need to worry about, because it's just more of a security concern. Now, here's where the fun things go. Validation of information is something quite complex that personally I'm not a fan of. It takes a long time to check. I think some of you already did this. Like, you have to check if something was a string, if something had the numbers, stuff like that. So to make validation easy, we're going to use Joy. So Joy is an NPM library that you can find on NPM, and it makes validation ultra easy. So I'm going to say that before I store a new user, it has to be an object with the following keys that are name, username, password, and email. Then the name has to be a string of min 1 character, trimmed and required. Username has to be a string, alphanumeric, min 4 characters, max 30, trim, required. As you can see, this makes it super easy to validate information. So we'll use this soon enough. Don't worry about it too much yet. And then we need to create our model. So remember, to create our model, you need to name it in singular, and it will create a database with plural of that word. So my actual collection will be named users, and then you have to give it a schema to create it. And then last but not least, we need to export everything by doing module.exports user joy schema. There we go. That's set up. Now let's start writing our user router. So our user router is going to look a bit like this. So let's do user.router.js. Then the usual, I have to require Express. There we go. Then we also have to require Joy. And what else? Oh yeah, we need to import our config and our user joy schema. So here we imported the HTTP status codes from our configs, and we imported our user and user joy schema from the model we just wrote. Then we start by defining our user router by just defining it like so, and we can now start creating the routes. So this part I'm just going to copy paste, because as I think you already saw, we're already half an hour in, and we're only like at what, 25% of the application. So let's just copy paste the code and let's go over this super quick. So this is that user router post. So that's the creation of new users. Now, the way this happens is we first define a new user object, and we extract everything from the body. The reason why you can do this, let's be clear here, is because previously in your server.js, remember how I told you to use this Express.js middleware? That's what parses the body. So if you send a JSON body, a JSON type request body, it parses it and it formats it like an object. So that's why we can do all of this. Then once that's set up, we do our joy validation. Remember how I told you we would use joy? So we import joy, call the validate method, and then we pass it the object that we just created with the user information. Then we pass in the user joy schema, so that's this joy schema, and then it compares it to see if it matches. If it doesn't match, then validation.error exists, and if it does exist, we respond with an HTTP status code of bad request and the JSON with the validation error. So basically, this makes validation a 2-line thing. It's amazing. Like when I see the curriculum, I think I like how they were doing it with no dependencies. But as you saw it was way more complex. It was like maybe 60, 100 lines of code. Here we're doing it in 2. So this is validation made easy. Then we have our first step towards creating a user. You need to make sure that another user doesn't exist with that username, user's email and username. So you're going to use the user.find one syntax. You're going to use the or syntax to check and find one with either of these two fields. So it's going to use the or syntax. And notice how I add a lot of comments with the official documentation. So if you have questions about how any of this works, the code on GitHub you will find has a link to every single place where any of this is covered. So that's what you should be using if you have questions after the session. Now, once you do try to find a user, if it exists, you do if user, and then if the user exists, there should be an error, right? Because you shouldn't be creating two users with the same username or email. So you respond with a status code of bad request with the JSON error, database error, a username with that username or password already exists. If he doesn't exist, then what we expected happens. We do user.hashPassword that hashes the user's password. And then once we have a password hash, we replace the new user's password with the password hash. And that way we will never store the real user's password. We store the hash. You will see that soon enough. Then once that's done, we create the new user. And once that's done, if the created user was created successfully, we respond the user with the HTTP status code of created, which should be the number 201. So we respond with that status code, and then notice how we don't return the created user. One of you had this question a few minutes ago. We use serialization, so you never return a raw MongoDB document because it contains sensitive information, including the password hash. You do not want the user to have that ever. So that's why we do serialization. And if you remember, the serialized method we built does not return the password field. That is why it's super important to always serialize information. And in case there's an error, we catch it and respond with an error of internal server error and the JSON error. All right. That's about it. So how about we populate the remaining methods, like getting other users and getting more than one user. So I'm just going to also copy that over here because these ones are thankfully really short. So let's do that right here. There we go. So here we're doing a user retrieval by doing a user router.get, and it's going to attempt to do user.find. If it finds some users, then we respond with an HTTP status code of OK. And then, because this is an array, we do users.map, and then each user, we convert it to its serialized form. So we will return with a JSON of an array of users that are all serialized. So that's how this works. Same thing as usual, catching the error, responding with the error. And then if you need to retrieve only one user, that's where router params come into action. So, to define a router param, you used to do a syntax, and that allows you to basically, this can be anything. So if I did /burger, then burger gets saved into the user ID parameter. So basically that allows the user to just fetch from the API a user's ID. Then we do user find by ID. We pass it the request param's user ID, which it extracts from the route. And if it finds it, same thing as before, spawn with a status code of OK and a JSON of the serialized user. All right. And then the error is catch, the usual thing. So far, I think we're good, right? Now, let's save that. Facundo question, why don't you use users/user ID? Great question. You're about to find out. Stay tuned. We are going to cover it in about 30 seconds. So before we can actually use the router, we need to export the router. So here I made a typo. It should be user router. There we go. So that's the user router. And then it's time to hook it up. So here's where we address your question. So basically, when you hook up the router, you can actually define a path for the route. So for example, where we're doing the middleware here, we're going to do app.use, and we're going to tell the path of that. It's going to be API/user. And here we just insert the user router, which doesn't exist yet because we haven't imported it. So let's do that right now. Let's import it. Just give me a second. And let's import it below config. That would be a good place, I think. Okay, so that's set up. So we use the user router and we hook it up so it's always set up to this route. So basically, if you want to access, for example, this route. A question from Giovanni. Why are you using API/user instead of a /user? Good question, to keep my sanity. So basically, when you start serving both front-end and server-side assets from one server, it can get hectic and confusing. So I like to add an API prefix to any route that responds with data, with information, with database records, stuff like that. So everything that has server-side code behind it, I just use API. It makes it easier for me. And then if it doesn't have API, it means it's something from the public folder. It's just something to help me out, to help keep my sanity once projects start becoming too large. And the reason why we write it here, for those, before you make the question, instead of adding it somewhere like here, it's quite simple. Imagine if we had like 30 route handlings in this one file, and then your boss came in and said, hey, change API user to API/users. You're going to be like, seriously? And you might be angry at your boss, but you shouldn't, because it was your fault to begin with. You didn't write code that was dry. So dry stands for don't repeat yourself. So if there's any code that you can reduce, you should do so, because we as humans are prone to errors. So the more maintainable and more readable you make your code, the better. That's what distinguishes amazing developers from regular developers. How good their code is, how readable it is, and how maintainable it is, how easy to update it is. So that's set up. Now, before we move on, let's also set authentication, which is kind of a pain point for many of the students here. So let's set that up. Let's create a new auth folder to deal with our authentication right now. So let's go to our auth.router, and before we do that, we also need to set up our auth.strategy. Whoops, forgot to make that a JS file. Now, authentication is definitely a very painful area for many users, so we're just also going to just copy the code here, but we're going to explain it in as much detail as we can. So that's before we do that, make sure you install the Passport local plugins and the Passport JWT plugins, because this is something you need if you want authentication to work. So having said that, let's just copy our entire authentication strategy here and let's explain it. So first steps first, we import Passport. Then we import our Passport local and Passport JWT strategies. Now, what are strategies? Well, strategies are basically middleware blueprints that you will create to authenticate endpoints. So the local strategy is what you will be using to authenticate when you want the user to provide a username and password combination, like on the login. But for other endpoints, when you don't want the user to keep typing his username and password, he's just going to send you a JSON Web Token, which is going to be like an ID card that you give them when they log in. So JWT strategy is going to be used for JSON Web Token authentication, and local strategy is going to be used for username and password authentication. Now, the local strategy is kind of straightforward. You receive the username and password, then you check if the user exists. If he doesn't exist, you reject the promise with a login error. If it does exist, then you run user.validate password against the password. This works because if you remember, we actually did go over this when we create the user model. There's the validate password method. So that's where we can do this. So we validate the password. If it is valid, basically we run the Passport verify methods. Don't worry if these don't make much sense. They're actually documented in this link I added right here. So you can open that link, and this explains why or how you have to call this callback at the end to get it to work. Is it intuitive? Heck no. I don't like it either. I hate it, to be honest. And I'll be frank with you, it took me like when I was first learning about Passport for this course, I need to understand this to teach you guys it. It took me a good 1-2 hours just figuring out why the heck they did it this way. It's not very good, but whatever. That's the way they did it. Let's deal with it. And if you have questions, just address the link. So we're on the callback to say everything went fine. Let the request go through. And then the JWT strategy is a bit simpler. It's just passing in the secret key, the JWT from request, and the algorithm encryption. And same thing goes. You use the same Passport verify callback shown here, and done. Those are the blueprints we'll be using to authenticate endpoints. Now, to actually use them, you need to create them. So you do passport.authenticate, and here you basically use the authentication for local JWT, and you create the middleware like so. So that's set up. Now we just export all of that like so. So we do local strategy, JWT strategy, and then we pass in the local and JWT Passport middleware, which we will use very, very soon. So before we can use that, we need to go to our server and add that authentication back in. So let's do that right now. Let's add, after our configuration, let's add our local strategy and JWT strategy configuration. And let's also, because we already imported password, let's get password to use that. So let's do passport.use, and we are telling it here that we want to use these two, local and JWT strategies. Whenever this is basically, all this is doing is hooking up our blueprint so that when we are using middleware that relies on local or JWT authentication, it uses that blueprint we just specified. So super important you do this step. And once that's set up, I think we're just about ready to add our actual authentication router. So to do that, we're just going to add our new router. So here is our auth router. Now, for authentication, we're going to need two plugins. So we're going to need that Express module, which you already are familiar with, but also the JSON Web Token module, which is what allows us to create new JSON Web Tokens. So let's install that right now. JSON Web Token. And we also need to make sure we're importing important authentication variables this time, notice how we don't import the blueprint. We import the actual middleware we created. So we import that. Then we import our JWT secret and our JWT expiry from our config file. And then we start creating our authentication router, which is where all the magic happens. So let's start by creating a tiny function, because we will be using this function quite a bit, to be honest. Let's call it create JSON Web Token. So all this does is it uses the JWT plugin we downloaded from npm. It signs a new token with the user information. It adds the JWT secret and other important parameters that are needed. If it doesn't make much sense, again, as usual, just go check out the official documentation. Everything we do everything you see doing require, and it doesn't look like it's a file on the project. You can find all of this going to npmjs.com. So npmjs is the official site for all these modules. So if you Google Express, there's the Express module. Here it is. Here's all the documentation. So questions, here's where you can find answers. Same thing goes. Have questions about how JSON Web Token, the JSON Web Token plugin works. You search for it, open it, read the documentation, and this explains all the features this has. And this should be your one go-to stop. So if you're getting stuck, people who want to help you are going to first wonder, did this student check the official documentation? Because if not, that should have been your first means of getting help. Okay, so that's set up. Now let's start writing our routes. Thankfully, because we have everything set up already, this is going to be super easy. So the login route is going to be basically just doing a post request to /login. Notice how we use the local passport middleware. If you remember, we said local middleware is for user and passport authentication, while JWT1 is for JSON Web Token authentication. So all this is going to do is, before this function is called, it's going to first go through passport's local authentication. It's going to see if it matches. If the user is valid and the password is valid, then it gets to this line, which is where we do because thanks to passport, we get the user inside of the request. This request.user, you will only be able to do it if you're using local or JSON Web Token authentication. So this is thanks to passport. Just love it how easy passport makes it. So we access the just logged in user's information, we serialize it, and then we create a new JSON Web Token with the serialized user. We use this function we just wrote right here. And then once that's created, we respond the client with the JWT token and the user object. You normally only need this one. The Thinkful curriculum only teaches you to do this one, but I like to return both because it's super helpful to also return the user that just logged in, right? Like the user ID, username, email, well, not password, but definitely the name, right? So that's set up. Now let's go to the refresh endpoint, which is something you're going to be using in case you want the user to basically, they have an old JSON Web Token and they just want a new one. So this time we don't use the local passport authentication, we use the JWT one, because this one expects the user to pass in a JSON Web Token. Once that's set up, we just, the same thing as before, we create a new token and we return with a new token and the user. And that's all we need to do. Now, to wrap this up, to wrap authentication, we just need to do app.use API/auth and then pass in our auth router, which we haven't exported yet. So let's fix that right now. So let's do auth router. You know, I could have done that a lot easier. When do we refresh web tokens? Good question. This is something you're going to have to decide, to be honest, depending on how long you keep them. I like to basically store in local storage when the user's token was generated. And every day they use it, if the token is almost close to expiring, I refresh it automatically. So it's something I think you need to decide by yourself, sadly, depending on the type of application you have and how secure it is. So that's about it. Oops, I forgot to export it. Let's fix that. Let's do module.exports auth router. There we go. Notice how I name everything super explicit, and that's because I think you all have this problem where when you code something today, you come back to it tomorrow and have no idea what you were doing. That happens to me so often. So I like to keep everything super explicit. Am I typing more? Yes, but who cares? Most of the time ends up going into troubleshooting and fixing code and enhancing code. So you should write your code as readable as possible. It's just something, people love you for it, trust me. So that's it up, and we're nearly close to completing it. The curriculum is not explicit. Can you clarify on that, Davey? Inning routes. Oh, yeah. I noticed that. I'm not a fan of that either at all, because then you have no idea where you're on. That's also why I notice how in my files, I like to name them with a suffix of what type of file that is, and also the file name. Even if I could have just named it router, the fact that it's called user router allows me to just switch tabs super quickly and then have a clear idea of what router that is. I don't know. I just like typing more if I can save myself a ton of time when working on large projects. So, but yeah, not to worry. It's definitely something people disagree with, but whatever. Let's keep moving on because we have 10 minutes. Oh my God, we're so close. We have the major route, which is the actual nodes route. So this is something that might sound like it would take some time, but nah, not really. We're just building on top of what we have. So let's create our node model. So what are our nodes going to look like? So our node model is going to look a bit like this. So I'm just going to import the code I already have. So we have our mongoose, which we will be using to create a mongoose schema. Then I made a typo, of course. Let me fix that typo here. So this is what my nodes are going to look like. I'm going to store, every node has to have a title, a content, a create date, an update date, and a user. Now, here's where it gets tricky. The create date is something that basically I have to provide when I create it. It has no default value. But the update date, I set it to the default of date.now. And what that allows me to do is every time I push an update, even if I don't add a date, it automatically updates. And that's fantastic for my use. The title and content are strings, which is something, well, it's title content, right? And here's where it gets interesting. I'm going to link each post to a user. So this has to be of type mongoose.schema types object ID. And in the reference, this is where I see a lot of students making mistakes. If you don't add the reference correctly here, this needs to be exactly the same as you defined it in the model. So this has to be exactly the same. Otherwise, it's not going to work. So make sure you have that wired up. So once that's wired up, let's just go into our next step, which would be adding the serialization method. Now, this one's going to be a bit more complex, so please bear with me. So in this one, what changes is we first check if this user object has a serialization method and if it's of type function. The reason why, if this hasn't been populated yet with data, then this is just an ID, like literally a numbered ID. So only if this has a serialized method, then I basically reassign the user to this.serialize, and otherwise I just replied with that user ID. You will see this in action very soon, so don't worry about it. And then last but not least, we return the actual node object right here. So here's return the ID, the user, title, content, create date, and update date. That's about it. Now let's continue with our validation schema, which I'm going to use right here. So here's how I validate my nodes. I make user a string and optional because it can't always be populated. I make my title and content strings of at least 1 digit that are required. and the create date can be just a timestamp, right? So that's my joy validation model. You will find the code on GitHub has these links all over the place. So if you're curious about how to validate even more structures that aren't looking maybe like this, you can find the links for validation here, which for some reason aren't opening. Let me just load that in the background. There we go. So here's all the different types of crazy validation you can do with the joy module. So here's, for example, let's any string. So valid, invalid, required, optional, description, notes, tags. If we go to the string one, which is somewhere here, there's date validation, there's functions validation, numbers validation, objects validation, and a crazy amount of string validations, like even email validation, alphanumeric validation. It's awesome. Like, it saves you so much time. But whatever. Let's just do that. So let's create our actual model. So the model, basically, if you're ever curious, the difference between the model and the schema will always serve as the blueprint for models. So every time you create a new document in Mongoose, it uses the schema to create it. And then the model is basically just an abstraction or an object representation of the connection you have to a collection. So it's just, in short, an object that lets you easily add, create, edit, push, and update and delete elements from a database. It just makes it so much easier. So you create models to communicate with the database. So that's set up. Now we can get started with our node router, which we will start writing right here. So let's add node.router. And as usual, let's import all the usual required mumbo jumbo. So it's going to be Express to create the router, Joy for validation. We're going to create the node router to actually hook up the routes. And then we actually also need to import a lot of configuration, like the status codes we will use, the JWT passport video. This is super important because you want your endpoints to be protected. And then last but not least, the actual node model and the node joy schema to validate the models. So let's start by creating the create new node endpoint that looks a bit like this. So here's my create new node endpoint. So node router.post slash, then we add the authentication. So basically, if the user doesn't provide a valid JSON Web Token in the as part of the request headers, the request will crash. You just won't even get to this point. So that's set up. So how about we just we create a new node, then we validate the new node so that if the user forgot to submit a title or content field, for example, it throws an error. If there are no errors during validation, then we try to create the node with the new node object. This one we created right here. So we try to create a new node, and then if it was created as a new, I actually made a typo here. As you can see, it just shouldn't be a new user. This should be created node. Yeah, that's a lot more explicit. So we respond with a status code of created, and we respond with a JSON of the just created node, but serialized. Notice how we never forget to serialize our documents. It's super dangerous that you forget to do so. So that's set up. And if there's an error, the usual, we respond with an interpret server error status code and a JSON error. Now, that's set up. Let's continue with our get one node by ID. This is also super helpful in case you just want to fetch one node. So let's type that in. This one's a lot shorter. Remember how we can get from the params. Question from Facundo. If it is super dangerous? Let me see your question. If it's super dangerous, you can't make serialization globally for our responses. Possibly. I haven't looked into that. To be honest, I just like being more explicit because that way there might be some situations where you do want to respond it unserialized. I think this is mainly for more advanced usage, but good point. I think it would definitely be probably a good idea to serialize everything by default. And I think it is possible. If I recall correctly, it's using the Mongoose pre-hooks. Look into that if you're interested. Just search Mongoose pre-hooks. That's what you want to be using, and there you can serialize the information before it actually even gets to you. But yeah, good call. That's very smart of you to think of that. So so let's go back to a router where we just retrieve one node by ID. So notice how we pass in the node ID as a param. Then we do node find by ID using the request params node ID. Notice how this has to match exactly this. Otherwise, you're going to have problems. And if it exists, here's where the fun stuff happens. remember how when I create the model, I created the user of type mongoose.schema type subject ID of reference user? Well, when I call populate on it, basically if it has a valid user, it's going to search the user's database, and if it finds it, it's going to inject the entire document for it. Super cool, right? So basically populating it is so that we've searched the user's database for the right user object and attach it to it. So the user can also have that. And that is exactly why when we did the serialization, we check if this.user is a valid entire user document, then we serialize it. If not, we just run with this.user because it's probably just a number ID. So just trying to explain the relation here. That's it up. So if it doesn't find it, then it just does this dot response. Okay, and we respond with the node serialized. If not, catch the error and respond with it. The usual stuff. Now, let's proceed with the updating, which is where it gets a bit more interesting. So we're going to do the update. I actually made a few typos here. So update node by ID. So let's do that. So we use the put endpoint for. Notice how also there should be a pattern like. Creating is always with post, fetching is always with get, and updating is always with put. Before I move to no, never mind. Yeah, the put is always the adding updates to nodes should always be done with the put endpoint. And then to add a new node update, you need to pass in the node ID you wish to update. Question from Giovanni: if we need to find node based on any other attributes like name, well, I would just build on our endpoint, basically. So I didn't add it because I don't need it. But if you do need to find a node based on other attributes, I just would build another endpoint to do that. Or even add a capability to search for that. But good question. Now, going back to how to update a node, it's very similar. We create a new object of node update that will be updating the title and content. Then we validate that it does have the title and content as required node parameters. We're using the node joy schema we defined. Remember the schema? This thing right here. So it validates it using this schema. And then if it doesn't have any errors and doesn't throw an error, as you can see right here, then it does the find by ID and update. It passes. You should first pass the request the params.node ID to give it the ID of the node it needs to update, and then the node to update. How did I figure it out? As always, looking into the official documentation, which you should always be doing. Even the pros do it. We do it all the time. And if you're not, that's easily the biggest thing that held me back when I was first coding up. I didn't use documentation a lot. And that was easily my biggest downfall. So if you aren't using it, get into the habit. Trust me, you're going to thank me later. It's just a huge mindset change when you start using the documentation to figure out why things are not working. So yeah, we update it. If it was updated because there's no content, we just respond with a status code of no content and end the request completely. Now, I did notice that I forgot to add the get endpoint, the get all nodes endpoint. So I'm going to add that right now. So let's just do a bit of backtracking. So right here, let's add that. So this will retrieve all of that user's nodes. Now, here's where it gets interesting. Because I only want to retrieve nodes from the currently logged in user, I do two things to kind of trick the system. Number one, I require JSON Web Token authentication via passport. And number two, when I do node.find, notice how this time I basically just I pass in a parameter called user, and I pass in the request.user ID. Where is the request.user ID? Passport. Passport's the reason why we can do this. So basically, thanks to Passport, we can access the decrypted JSON Web Tokens user, and we can access the ID. So basically, we're filtering only to show nodes that belong to that current user. Then we populate the user in case. Well, this one doesn't make much sense since why would the user need the user? But whatever. I just do it in case I need it. And then I just respond the user with the usual status code of OK. And because this is a nodes array of raw MongoDB nodes, I use map to create a new array that will serialize each node. So I only return sanitized data. And yeah, that's about it. And Question from Adriana. Let me check your question. Is it possible to have two different serialized objects to send different data to different endpoints? I don't really get your question. Could you maybe rephrase that? And what happens if you want to have more than one middleware on an endpoint? Oh, you can totally do it. You can just, if you're ever curious, like literally, Google search it. So, Express add more than one middleware. Rebecca Green, sharing your GitHub link. The YouTube copy is obviously not live yet because I haven't finished recording, sadly. So when I finish recording it and pushing it, I will be pushing that to the Slack. And the GitHub link, I pasted it on the Slack. Not on the Slack, on the chat for this. Now, let me try to hurry up because we're out of time and we still haven't added the last endpoint, which was the cherry on the top, and that was the delete endpoint. So let's just add the delete endpoint. So let's just copy that over here at the end. So here's the delete endpoint. So removing the node by ID. So same as before, we make sure the user is authenticated. Then we pass in the node ID, and it does node find by ID and delete, and it just uses the actual node ID we just passed in and deletes it. If everything went fine, respond with no content and enter a request. Otherwise, catch the error, handle it, and respond with a JSON of the error. Now, we're pretty much done as far as I know. So let's hook everything up. So our node router is now complete. Let's go to our server.js and hook up our node router. So we first import it like so. So let's name this node router and let's change this to, node. There we go. So that's the node router. Then we have to also hook up the URL. So that looks a bit like this. API/node. And let's just do node router. Okay. And I think now's the time to actually test this. And I'm going to be super brutally honest with you guys. I have no idea if this is going to work. Why? Because I'm human, I make mistakes. So I don't trust myself to not have made a single coding mistake during the entire hour. So I'm going to try to run it. If I can't get it to run, I'm just going to switch to the finished version, which I have on my other screen. So let me see what I missed. Let's see what error we got. It might be something easy to fix. Of course, we had some problems installing bcrypt. Why did the bcrypt not install? Let me try that one more time. If not, I might try it via my Windows terminal. Let's see if it installs this time. Come on. Yeah, it looks like it is. Oh, crap. Yeah, no, not installing. Let's try it one last time via the desktop. cd desktop, npm install bcrypt. Like, I'm sure I can troubleshoot this issue, but we're already out of time. So I don't think I have time to fix why it's not installing correctly. So I just installed it via the normal command line. And I'm also getting problems. So, okay, plan B then it is. Let's switch to the finished project, which I have right here. So let me close everything. So it's very similar looking, as I think you already noticed. It's pretty much the same thing we just built. So let's set this up. Let me do git add all, git stash, just to undo my changes that I just did over the session. Just some notes that I wrote to help me out. There we go. Now let's start the project like so. There we go. This is the actual live version that is on GitHub. So notice how it's a lot more commented. And I did this to make it easier. So if you get lost what each line is, I tried to make everything as explicit as possible. So yeah, that's running. Now let's test it out. So first step is logging in. So I'm going to, before logging in, I of course need to create a new user. So let's create a new user. So let's quickly create a new user. Now here's the one I made. I'm just going to add a new one. So I'm going to name this, I don't know, let's call this John Doe. Username John Doe. Let's make the password John Doe 123. Let's make this John Doe. There we go. That looks like a valid new user. Let's make a request to it. And we should be getting, there we go. That's the confirmation. We get the ID of the newly created user, name, email, and username. That's it up. Let's continue with the logging in. So let's do auth login. Now notice how it's a post request API/auth/login. We log in with the newly created users. So John Doe. Let's name this John Doe 123. And let's see if we can log in. There we go. So notice how we get a JSON Web Token and the user as part of it. So this time we are not going to close it, but I'm going to be storing this into a variable. Postman is super amazing once you can use it to its full potential. So I'm creating just some variables here. So I'm updating my JSON Web Token to be the newly created one. And there we go. Now that I have a valid JSON Web Token in my clipboard, this one, it's super important. I can finally use my authenticated endpoints. Let's try retrieving the user's nodes. So let's go to authorization, bearer token, and let's paste in our JSON Web Token. Let's make a send request, and we should be getting an empty array because that user hasn't created anything, right? There's absolutely nothing. So let's start there. There's a just database, by the way. Notice how in the users collection we have our user, and more importantly, take a look at the password. Remember how I told you we don't store passwords? This is proof of that. We store the hash of the password, but we never send it to user. It's just to keep things more secure. But yeah, coming back to it, let's create a new node super quickly. So make sure our authorization token is correct. There's our authorization bearer token, JSON Web Token. And in the body, let's just create a super simple post called my first node. And then exclamation marks. Let's send that. And there we go, my first node. We have our user ID, or ID the node, the user ID that just created it, the title, the content, create date, update date, everything. And to prove that, I'm just going to click on refresh on the collections and see how in the nodes, here's a newly created node. So there's the object ID linking the ID, the user that created it, the title, the content, create date, update date, everything. That's set up. Now let's try to retrieve our nodes again. So let's click here again. And there we go. We have that user's nodes. Let's try adding a few more just to test this out. Let's add my new node 1. Let's try my new node 2 and my new node 3. So we created 1, 2, and let's leave it at 2. I think that's already 3 nodes. Let's try making a request call again. And there we go. Here's our 3 user nodes. Now let's try updating one. So let's modify that my first node 1. Let's go to update node. Let's paste the node we want to update. And also let's make sure we have the right headers. Remember, you have to have the JSON Web Token. Otherwise it's going to fail. So you go to bearer token, paste the JSON Web Token, and you go to body. And let's change it to, I don't know, let's change this to modified node. Let's run that, and let's hope we get there we go. So it looks like that error out, but pay attention to the code. It's 204 no content. So that means it was a success. To test it out, we retrieve the user's nodes. So notice how the node number 2, there's the modified node we just did. And then last but not least, let's test the delete node endpoint. To test it out, as usual, let's check out we have the right JSON Web Token authorization header. Let's go to the retrieve user nodes. Let's fetch that. So let's go here. Oh, Facundo, can you try to make the API fail? Yes, I will in a second. Let's just get through this first. So let's delete the last node, my first node 2. So let's add that in our path. Let's try to delete it and let's see what happens. No content. So good. That looks like that worked. Let's test it out. Let's click send. There we go. We have 2 nodes. We just successfully tested all our API endpoints. Now, to wrap up, as you mentioned, Facundo, let's get these to crash. Let's try making this request one more time and see what happens. So it looks like it succeeds, but it might be because this is a Mongo thing that if you try to delete the same node twice, it just doesn't throw an error. Maybe let's try what could we try breaking? Maybe we could try adding a new like making the route look wrong, like adding a knee at the end. Of course, that returns a 404 error of not found. So as you can see, it's because you didn't use the correct name of the API. So that's the first common error you can get. The second ultra common error, which this is, I think, super important, and I'm kind of regretting that the few users that left didn't pay attention to this. You should always use username and password as login parameters. I've seen some users some students that try to use the email for login purposes. I don't blame you. That'd be cool, but you do need to make some changes to your password authentication for this to work. Because if you change this even slightly, notice how now it just throws an error. Bad 400 bad request, and these are insanely hard errors to troubleshoot, mainly because it just doesn't give you anything information, to be honest. And more often than not, the best information it gives you is going to be in the headers. But yeah, it takes forever for students to figure this out. So make sure you're passing the username and password every single time. Otherwise, you're going to get bad request errors. And that's about it. Holy crap. I apologize if this wasn't definitely within the 1 hour, but I think you saw, like, it's an insane amount of content to cover within 1 hour, and it would be impossible to, let alone write it manually or try to just cover it within the hour. The good news is, as I did mention, all the code is on GitHub, so it took me quite a long time, to be honest, to build the code, because not just the code, that all the comments that are so if you look at the final version, the app, everything is super commented out. Especially what I would like for you guys to pay attention to is the links. The links are amazing, so that if you have questions for, I don't know, if you have a question regarding how a specific plugin worked, always get into the habit of checking the documentation, especially Passport. I'm surprised so many students have problems with authentication, and all of my students, well, to be honest, I don't blame you. Nobody tells you to do this, but get into the habit of looking up the official documentation. It just makes you, I don't know, like I blame myself for not knowing this sooner, but at the same time you can't because nobody told you. But now I'm telling you, so start doing it. Thank you so much for the comments. I really appreciate them, but please don't leave. If you could just give me 1 more minute of your time, I would super appreciate it. Basically, this workshop took a long time to make, as you can probably imagine, so I would at least appreciate if you guys could just answer a super quick 2-3 question feedback form, and it's literally just rating from 1 to 10, not actually answering anything. So if you guys could answer that for me, that'd be great, just so that I can know, like, maybe I thought I did a good job, maybe I can improve it. I would love to improve it. Even if you guys think it was good, I love to improve things. So if you can give me some feedback, I would be ever so grateful. So here's the form. It's fully anonymous, so if you want to give negative feedback, awesome. I enjoy negative feedback because that's what makes me improve. Like, success teaches you nothing, failure does. So if you ever have a code blow up on your face, be sure that it's you learning something. Question from Rebecca. Will you be recording the second session later? Yes, I will. Thank you for asking. Yes, I will be recording that. I'm pushing that to YouTube because, yeah, I know I definitely rushed through the content, but I tried to do it just keeping in mind that that you can watch the recording and pause it. So what does the second part cover? Glad you asked. Part 2, I think, would be also insanely helpful to most of you, and it's actually about testing. So if you go to Thinkful Workshops, you can find it. It's exactly about 1 hour from now, or maybe 45 minutes because I went a bit overboard. So you can find it here, Build Full Stack Application Part 2, and it's going to be all about unit testing. How to unit test all the router endpoints we just built, how to write all the tests for them and get them to pass, and explain why we need to build tests a specific way, and maybe even do some best practices to help you test and to help make testing easier. We'll probably even debug the tests if we have the time. So definitely consider attending that session. Question from Davey: if you do part 3 frontend, will it be done in jQuery or React? I will probably do jQuery, definitely. The reason why, most of the students watching this are still doing their Node capstone, which they don't know it React yet. So I will be doing part 3 if I do it, which I do want to do it because I feel like a lot of my students have had problems wiring up the front end to the actual backend. So I might do it next week, maybe on Wednesday. So it will be probably just covering how I built this entire front end, which I think you would actually enjoy a lot because my front end is very different to Thinkful's, to be honest. This is where I actually do things quite a lot differently. I use some design patterns, program design patterns, to make my components much easier. So I have my code super modular. So for example, if you go to the utilities, I organize my code a lot more neatly, which I think you guys could benefit from learning how to do. Like organizing, for example, all the Ajax HTTP calls into just one HTTP module. So it makes it super easy to just write modular JavaScript pages with this. So I will go into detail on how I did this and how you can do this too in your files, so that your index page, I've seen student index pages that are 500 lines long. Mine is how many lines? 78 lines. That's all I need. So yeah, stay tuned for part 3 if you're interested. And yeah, a question from Fracundo. Sorry I didn't get back to you so soon. Dude, you don't have this workshop on the drop down of the form. Oh, really? Holy crap, that's huge. Thank you for letting me know. Oh my god. Let me check that out super quick. Well, I guess you could group it with build a full stack capstone from scratch, even if it's not part 1. Sorry about the confusion. I don't blame you. I should have been more explicit. Just group it under build a full stack capstone from scratch. That should be your last option, I think. You just click on choose, and it's one at the bottom. But yeah, thank you for answering that. I appreciate it. And yeah, I guess I already shared the code, the link. I'm going to share it just one more time in case you're interested. And remember, you can also test this on the link. It's live on Heroku, and you can debug all the code. If you're interested, just open the DevTools, go to the sources panel, and you can find all the code that is running live on this panel. And you can debug it. And if you have questions, especially on how authentication works, just take a look at this, and especially take a look at the utilities, especially the HTTP module utilities. That's where I do the actual authentication, and here's where I'm sending the actual JSON Web Token. So, yeah, I guess that's about all I have for you guys on this part. Can you share with us your YouTube channel? Well, I guess you will find it when I post the link. It will be linked by me because I will be publishing my YouTube channel. I don't have too many videos, to be honest, just the ones I pushed as workshops, but I do want to start maybe some small tutorial series on topics that I find students struggle a lot, like the dev tools, debugging, things like that. So thank you so much, Adriana, for your kind comments. I appreciate it, and I am glad you guys enjoyed it. It makes it almost worth it, all the time that I put into this. Yeah, I worked on this for a long time, but that's cool. I don't know, I just felt like there was maybe some minor lack of consistency in the Thinkful curriculum in some occasions. So I felt like just doing something from start to finish will probably go a long way to clarify a lot of questions, like the authentication final lesson doesn't cover how to wire that up into the CRUD, the Mongo CRUD, create, read, update, and delete. Same thing goes, it doesn't go into detail into how to wire that up into the front end. So that's why I also did this whole thing. But yeah, I think that's about all that I have for my part. I feel kind of bad leaving instantly after going over time, so I'm going to give you guys 5 minutes. I'm going to stay here 5 more minutes in case any of you have questions that you'd like to make, comments, anything. But if you have nothing for me, feel free to leave. Super happy with all the comments. I'll take a look at the feedback form later, and I hope I will see some of you during part 2 in about, 40 minutes from now? Sure. See you, Davey. Question from Adriana. For example, at the get all endpoint, send just the title and author of the nodes, but at the get by endpoint, you would like to send all the data about the node. Is it possible to have different serialized objects with both data content? Oh, I see. Okay. I think I do see it. So, yeah. Actually, you can, and it's as simple as just adding a new method. That's actually, and that's a very good question. Wow, that's smart. Let me show you how you do that. So if you're interested in doing that, the serialized method is named serialized only because we named it serialized. So if you would like to, you can just create another serialized method and name it serialized too, or maybe even more specific. Maybe call it serialized primary info or serialized secondary info, or name it whatever you want. But yeah, you probably expected the answer to be super complicated, but no, it's not. Things often end up looking that way. Like, I can't believe it was that easy. But yeah, it happens to all of us. Now, question from Rebecca Green. I'm actually from the data science side, so was wondering what software most app developers use for building apps? Is it most of Visual Studio? What do most Mac developers use? Oh, good question. I think I can relate because I do development on both Mac and Windows. So it depends what kind of app. So there's tons of kinds of apps. For those unaware, you can also even code desktop applications like Mac, Windows, and Linux applications using JavaScript. You can code them using something called Electron.js, and that allows you to build cross-platform desktop apps using just JavaScript, HTML, and CSS. Don't believe me? All these apps were built with Electron, including Skype, Hyper, Slack, and even VS Code. It was built entirely only using JavaScript, HTML, and CSS. But whatever. I think you were meaning maybe web apps, web applications, and there's three main pillars. It's Sublime, VS Code, and Atom. It's kind of a split of which you prefer. I personally advocate strongly for VS Code because it's the more powerful of the three, and it's the more well-rounded of them all. So I really like using VS Code, and the best news, it's fully 100% cross-platform, so it works on Mac as well. No flaws. Just be wary. Please don't confuse VS Code with the full-blown Visual Studio version, which is definitely not what you want to be using. And for smartphone apps, that will also depend because you can build smartphone apps natively, like with Java code for Android or Swift or Objective-C for iOS. But in case you weren't also familiar, you can also use JavaScript to build mobile apps using something like React Native, which allows you to build mobile applications using also only JavaScript. And in that case, I would also use VS Code. If not, if you were doing things natively, then you would probably want to use the actual editor for that language. So for Android, you would use Android Studio, and for Mac, you would use what's the name? I forgot the name. There's crap. I hate it, but it's Xcode. Yeah, I'm not a fan of it. Question from Facundo. Node is beautiful for create CLI tools, and you can create extensions of VS Code with Node. Yes, totally. I fully agree with you. A question from Shirvani. Any sessions for integrating Graph with Node.js? Do you mean GraphQL?
Yeah, something like I just started with my Node capstone.
Mm-hmm.
I want to show the graphical representation of the data. So I was just thinking.
Oh, okay. Yeah, sure, totally. So that's something you wouldn't use Node for because Node is for server side and graphs are something visual. So you want to be showing graphs on the server on the front end. So sure, Rebecca. Yeah, did you make the comment? Who made the comment? Yeah, Rebecca. No worries. Thank you for attending. Enjoy the rest of your day. Now, going back to you, Shivani.
Yes.
If you want to make graphs on the front end, there's a lot of good graphing libraries on JavaScript. Let me remember. There's quite a ton of them. So let me see which ones will be. There we go. Char.js. That was definitely it. So you might want to look into Char.js because there's a lot of more complex ones, especially D3.
Okay.
If you haven't heard about D3, you will very, very soon. So D3 is the industry standard for building graphs. It's very, very, very advanced. It allows you to make insanely complex graphs. Like all of these here, these are all D3 built. And they are all insanely interactive. So they're not just static graphs. Like you can actually notice how it updates in real time. So D3 is awesome, but I wouldn't recommend it. Reason being, because of how robust it is, it has a very high learning curve. Like it's not easy to do. I tried it. I made some graphs in the past. I didn't like it. I definitely didn't find it very intuitive to use. I've heard great things about Chart, so I would definitely maybe try out Chart.js first. I just feel like maybe it looks like the page already looks a lot more intuitive and friendly than D3. But I hope that helps you out. And yeah, Adriana made a comment that there's a D3 workshop on graphs that TJ teaches.
Yes.
Thank you for letting us know, Adriana. You might want to consider that too, in case maybe it's not as complex as I remember it. But yeah, this is my own personal take. It's often a better idea to start with the easier tool. But yeah, I hope that answered your question. Anybody else? I think I have time for one more question. See you soon, Adriana. We still have 4 more people left. So does anybody else have maybe Adriana or Facundo one last question before I run? Okay, I'll wrap it up here then. Thank you, everybody, and I'll see you soon. Bye-bye.